Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Grand Rounds. My name's Tom Fodden, and I'm one of the chairs of Grand Rounds, along with Leslie Crichton, who can't be with us today, but we'll be here next week as we move into a couple of sessions for the Global Citizenship team, and I'll give you some more information about those talks in next week's email. So we move on from last month's LGBT plus talks, which I think were fantastic, and I was really pleased that we were able to do 2 talks in February this year rather than the usual one. I think those talks went down really well, and the mix of the 2 talks over the fortnight gave a really nice spread of how we're trying to think about LGBT issues here in NHS Tayside and the bigger picture. And thanks again to Katie for coming back to Grand Rounds. As I said, she's been at Grand Rounds so many times now, I should give her her own channel. But thanks very much to both the speakers, and to Kevin as well for standing in for me 2 weeks ago to chair. This week, we move on to a talk which is, I'm very pleased to introduce Jeff Williams. We've just had a brief discussion that we're from opposing sides of the Pennines. He's the Lancastrian and I'm the Yorkshireman, but we're brothers in arms, really, of being from what we think is the north, but of course is just the Midlands of the UK. And Jeff is going to talk to us today about well-being and about the service that NHS Tayside provides for us in terms of well-being and self-care, which I think is incredibly timely given the stress that we're all under. Whether you're a clinician or whether you're in a non-clinical role, the stress that COVID has put upon us over the last year, and it is the 1-year anniversary almost to the day of our first COVID case, and the importance of self-care, the importance of looking out for each other, the importance of taking time to look after ourselves. So I'll not talk any more over Jeff's presentation. I have to nip off because I'm on call. I hope to get back to be able to field the questions. If not, Kevin McConville has agreed to stand in just to field those questions. I'll be able to watch the talk on YouTube later, and don't forget to check out our YouTube channel to look at all the previous talks. And I am uploading previous talks that go way back to 2015 even. Jeff, I apologize that I can't stay in person to listen to your talk, but I will watch it on YouTube later, and please share your screen now, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think that was just purely an excuse. Once he discovered I was from Lancashire, he decided he wasn't going to hang around. Got nothing to learn from a Lancastrian, but we will not go into our ancient tribal warfare. Folks, it's good to be with you today. When I was asked to come and speak about our staff wellbeing work, one of the things that was asked was whether I had a title for the talk, which actually led me to a lot of soul searching, because very often I just have a sort of bog standard self-care and well-being sort of title, but it really made me think a bit about, you know, what would grab you as people at a very active frontline end of a medical career. And I guess the main parallel was that of Formula One drivers, and the title really that even Formula One drivers need pit stops. And I don't know if any of you ever watch F1 Grand Prix, but there have been a number of occasions where drivers have decided to ignore team instructions and to stay out on the track, and have either blown a tire or run out of fuel, had a mechanical failure, despite all of the signs that the engine management system was giving. So I felt that was maybe an apt metaphor today, really, is just to help encourage all of us to consider the fact that we cannot expect ourselves to sort of drive all the time in our healthcare roles and as human beings without either putting something in the tank or doing some maintenance work, I guess, on our lives themselves. So I'll speak a bit more if I can get the slides to move. That works. So my name is Jeff Williams, and I'm part of the staff wellbeing service that the Department of Spiritual Care operates in here in NHS Tayside. So I've been in Tayside since 2012 now, so it's coming up for 9 years. And I'm employed here as a chaplain. Originally, when I started, I was the chaplain for Murray Royal Hospital in Perth, a mental health hospital, and also covering the Rohalian, the forensic mental health unit. And then just about a year ago, I got a promotion to senior chaplain and a dedicated role focusing on staff wellbeing. But before 2012, I worked in Blackburn in East Lancashire, down in the northwest of England. I was trained as a person-centred counsellor and was a member of a primary care mental health team down there. A team, interestingly, that in that part of Lancashire was probably about 25 to 30 strong. That's what a big what a size commitment they had in terms of a multidisciplinary mental health in a primary care context, which was fantastic, really. It was really, really great. So I bring that sort of counselling mental health background into my work up here and into the department. Now, when people think about spiritual care, classically, they'll be thinking and interpreting the concept of a chaplain in a religious sense. And indeed, I do have that background, having been a church minister for over 22 years in the past. But in Scotland, departments of spiritual care don't operate on an exclusive model of what we would call religious care. We operate on the principle of spiritual care, which is more generic and person-centred in its approach. So those of us who are employed by the NHS as chaplains operate as chaplains in a generic sense. We work with all staff, all patients, all family members and carers, whether you have a religious belief or not. We all believe stuff about ourselves, about the world and our place in it. And so we meet people where they are, working in a person-centered way to focus on what gives people a sense of meaning and hope, significance and purpose for their lives. And that's where really the rubber hits the road. So for the last few years, we've been running a staff wellbeing service that focuses on providing one-to-one staff support sessions. And at the moment, those are either over face-to-face or over the phone. And obviously, latterly during COVID, we've started doing those over Microsoft Teams as well. But what we found is that over the last 3 years, our one-to-one staff support service has really been growing year on year. Now, staff are able to come and see us, whether they're working in Angus, in Dundee or Tayside. They can ring and make an appointment. They can email in and make an appointment. And they can also access our service through urgent out of hours phone number, because we always have a member of staff on call 24 hours. And indeed, I have to say that aside from the sort of standard calls that chaplains might have out of hours, I've had calls from staff members in the middle of the night who've maybe been on duty and have faced a very difficult, traumatic situation and have needed somebody to talk to there and then. But it might surprise you that we're actually probably the biggest provider of one-to-one person-centred staff wellbeing support in Tayside. Previously, occupational health had their own counselling service. That counselling service has now been contracted out to Care First, and Care First are a provider of counselling and various other inputs to support staff as well. And you can find details about them on StaffNet. But what we would say is over the last 2 to 3 years, our services, as I've said, have just sort of rocketed and taken off. And we find that staff who've used our service and have found that it really works for them have then gone away and told sort of good news stories to other members of staff, their colleagues, about how effective our service has been at supporting them. And we get plenty of managers coming and using our service. And interestingly enough, we often find that managers will either recommend then our service to their team members who have maybe been struggling, who are off sick, or whatever. And sometimes managers disclose that they themselves have used the service and that they would thoroughly recommend their team take it up. And so when you've got people recommending it personally like that, really the service sells itself. And indeed, there have been times when we really haven't had to publicize our service at all because those good news stories have worked for themselves. It's worth just saying that it doesn't matter what's going on for you, whether it's a work life issue or whether it's a personal home life issue or your issues around your own health. We will see you for anything that's going on in your life. Our main interest is to support staff to be as well as they can be. And we realise that that has a positive benefit for the organisation because in general, that means that if someone's off sick, for whatever reason, in general, that helps them to get back to work sooner, helps them to get back to work in a better state, a better condition. And for staff members who see us while they're still at work, very often what they've said is that our service has enabled them to stay at work and not take time off sick. So those are all really positive benefits to the organisation. But it is worth saying that the service doesn't work on the basis of managers referring you to us and then wanting a report back. Our service is confidential. So what is discussed in our one-to-one sessions is simply between ourselves as the providers and yourselves as staff. And we don't break confidentiality for any other reason other than to protect your health and well-being, particularly if you were posing to be a risk to your own life or if someone else, particularly children, were at risk. So, but the bottom line is we don't routinely report back to managers. That is between us and you in terms of what you talk about. So last year, during 2020, obviously we were already providing our work when COVID hit. What we actually found was there was a sudden cessation in people at the beginning of the COVID lockdown. There was a sudden stop in people accessing our service. And then about 3 to 4 months in, people started coming back into the service. And so last year, despite 3 months of not really seeing anybody, we provided 450 staff with ongoing one-to-one support sessions, which is, a fantastic number. I'm trying to remember now what the percentage ended up being overall. I'll probably give you a duff stat at this stage, but I think it was something like 4 or 5% of NHS staff in Tayside accessed our service for one-to-one support last year. So there's details there, and I'll put that slide up at the end of the session. One of the other services that we offer to NHS Tayside staff is values-based reflective practice. This is a particular model of reflective practice, which has been devised through NHS Education for Scotland and the departments of spiritual care across NHS Scotland have been at the forefront of delivering and providing training for that and seeing that propagated out across the health boards. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. And then the other thing is that we run group workshops. And one of the workshops that we run, there are a number, but one that's been particularly significant during the last 12 months is on self-care and well-being. What we've discovered is that through seeing hundreds of staff every year through our one-to-one service, we build up a really good picture of what's going on for staff, and especially what's going on for staff that's causing them to struggle to be at work across the organisation. We build up a really good picture of that. Now, obviously, some of the stuff's people's personal lives, bereavements, relationship breakdowns, family issues, and some of it is people's personal physical health. But a lot of it is around stuff that staff are struggling with at work, stress, anxiety, related issues, depression. But for a lot of them, there are issues at work that are creating those symptoms for them. And so what we decided it would be good to do was, instead of just trying to mop up the mess and deal with casualties afterwards, after all the problems had happened, we thought it would be good to try and run proactive workshops that help staff understand some of the issues and help them think ahead of time before they get to a place of burnout. Because what we've actually discovered is that many staff haven't been seeking any type of support for their struggles. And so they just keep going until they reach a point of burnout, because their normal coping strategies have just been running dry. And eventually, you know, without looking after ourselves better, we all reach a point of running on empty. And that's been a key metaphor that we've used. And so our staff wellbeing workshops have been set up to look at that. So what we realized was that burnout was creeping up on a lot of staff without them always realizing. People would develop sort of stress symptoms. They weren't sleeping. They would be bursting into tears, getting really angry and blowing up at colleagues and at family members. So our workshops are helping people to reflect on what we can do proactively to look after our well-being, so that we don't get to that place, and so that we've got enough personal resources to be able to cope with some of the stresses and difficulties as they happen. So I think one of the points here is to help all staff realise that there's more to our well-being than meets the eye. And one of the things that we've discovered is very often people just think about their well-being on a couple of basic levels. Most of all, people will think about their mental well-being, and then other than that, they'll think about their physical well-being, either their body having enough energy, physical energy, am I eating and sleeping, and am I managing to avoid getting ill? But helping people to realise actually there are more dimensions to wellness and well-being helps people to look at their lives in a broader way. And one of the things our workshops do is help people to maybe just do a bit of a sort of well-being audit of their lives. And we introduce these 7 dimensions of wellness: emotional, physical, spiritual, which can involve religious belief, but it doesn't have to. It's very much about the sort of existential nature of stuff, the meaning and purpose. Occupational wellness, social wellness, our relationships, environmental, and then intellectual. And intellectual can be, about the brain and growing academically, but you know, I have a saying that living things grow, and that all of us as human beings have an innate desire and need to grow. And that isn't simply about intellectual growth. It's about stimulation. It's about avoiding stasis. It's about avoiding boredom and feeling stuck. And in fact, you know, people are very often surprised to realize that that type of stasis, stuckness, boredom, that ends up people just vegetating really and going into a state of decline because they're not getting stimulated, they're getting used and expended. That can be a significant stressor in people's lives too. So when we help people do a bit of a sort of well-being audit of their lives, we encourage people to think about these 7 areas and identify things in their lives that are found in each one of these 7 categories. And what we discover is that a lot of people, a lot of staff members have got stuff in maybe 2, 3 or 4 of these, but there are maybe 3 or 4 categories where they've paid no consideration whatsoever. And the actual fact that investment in some of those opens up some opportunities that they never realized they had. A lot of times when we're stressed, you know, when we're on a pattern of decline or towards burnout, we'll very often feel a loss of autonomy, a loss of control over our lives, like we don't have many choices. And what we find is that helping people to identify possibilities for making new choices in their lives helps people to feel like they have some degree of control back over their lives. And when we have a sense of our own autonomy, a sense that we have power to change ourselves and our situations, then that in itself has a big impact on people's well-being. And so exploring these areas, and that's helping open people's eyes, has been a key part of those workshops. So a question here for you is, do you notice anything significant in this image? You might realize that it's taken from an airline safety briefing. And I remember the first time I ever saw this picture, I remember being really baffled by it. I was thinking, why on earth would an airline put a mother who's supposed to care for her child, putting the oxygen mask on herself first? And that was my first initial reaction. And I guess to some degree, that was the airline's point. It wanted to stimulate people to think about how they cared for children, how they cared for minors on aeroplanes. Well, of course, you may have realized that the reason that was put on the safety briefings was because originally what they found when they introduced oxygen masks onto planes was that in emergencies, when the oxygen masks dropped, most parents or grandparents instinctively just went to put the oxygen mask on their panicking child as quickly as they could. And it's difficult, especially with a young panicking child, to get an oxygen mask onto them. And of course, you'll know that they then found that what was happening was that the lack of cabin oxygen meant that the parents' oxygen levels declined very quickly, and there was an increased risk of them passing out and being no use to the child, never mind to themselves. So when we ask this question, why is self-care so important for the caring professions? We realize, of course, it's for this reason. How can you look after others if you don't look after yourself? Now, there's a recognition here that the NHS staff, and we're in the caring profession, and by the nature of it, that means that we're more likely to attract people who by nature have a caring disposition. That is the willingness and desire to care for others, and our professional identities are set up around that. So it can feel instinctively the wrong thing to do to put ourselves first, to look after ourselves ahead of others. And very often that mental block is what stops us paying attention to our own need to care for ourselves. It's immensely important. Now, I was looking this up, going back to our metaphor of even Formula One drivers need pit stops. The world record, as I understand it, in Formula One for the fastest pit stop is 1.88 seconds, and that was Max Verstappen's Red Bull team. And can you imagine changing a full set of tires in 1.88 seconds? I think that did not include refueling the car. Absolutely astonishing feat. But it also tells us something, I think, about when we're busy, high-performing people. What happens is we tend to give very little time to looking after ourselves. And if we have to do it, we tend to jam it in here or there and cram it or squeeze it and then move on with what we see as the real business. But of course, that can be a problem because it's easy for us to then ignore the signs. One of the things I was reflecting on when I was being invited to come and speak to you today was, why don't we see many doctors using services such as ours? Because I have to say, I mean, probably in the last 3 years, I think I've probably seen 4 or 5 doctors. And I would have to say I've probably seen 40 times, 50 times the amount of nurses and other professionals, AHPs, all sorts of professions. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that doctors aren't caring for themselves, that you guys aren't caring for yourselves. But the question is where you're doing it and how and to what extent are you doing it. I think that's a significant issue. One of the things that I identify in our modern culture is that I believe that we live in a pain-killing culture, where the first commandment of a pain-killing culture is thou shalt not feel. So many people, when they go to a doctor, they want a tablet. They don't always want to fix the problem. They want a tablet. Give me a tablet so I don't feel the pain. I just want to get on with my life. In other words, give me the quick fix. And that can permeate down to our own attitudes for ourselves. In other words, just, help me not to feel like this as quickly as possible, and then I'll get on, and I can get on with my life. And the question is really, is that a satisfactory solution? Because what we can end up doing is just covering up the problem without ever dealing with the causes. And by that, I mean the causes to our burnout, causes to our high stress levels, and to our anxiety levels. And what we find is that people, if they neglect self-care and only end up covering up the real causes, end up getting to a place where they are running on empty and they've not got much left in the tank. And we address things like that in our one-to-one sessions, but in our workshops, we try and approach that in a proactive sense and to explore that so people have time to identify that going on in their lives. Now, using the example of a fuel tank in a car, the obvious question here is that, if we're thinking about running on empty, how would you know you were running low on fuel? Well, very conveniently, car manufacturers have given us lots of engine warning signs, and one of those is the fuel gauge. And it's not just that the fuel gauge will tilt across to red. Conveniently now, there's a special light that flashes up, and my Volvo comes up with a written message and even an audible warning sound to tell me. A few weeks ago, I saw a 70 reg BMW 7 Series with a very forlorn guy stood with an empty green fuel can at the back of his car, and his wife was remonstrating with him angrily. How could you let this happen? But on a modern car, you have to say the only way that can happen is if you avoid looking or paying attention to the warning signs. And yet, our bodies are giving us warning signs, and yet very often we persistently ignore them. And we'll self-medicate in all sorts of ways or avoid in order to just keep carrying on with our activity. The point is, though, that we pay an emotional, psychological price for that. It's almost like a credit card debt. You go into emotional debt that has to be paid back at some point. You can't just keep giving. And so it's very important for us all to be aware of the warning signs that our minds and bodies are given to us. I'm quite interested in military history, and one of the toughest military training courses in the world is the United States Navy SEAL BUDS training and assessment camps. And you can go online and watch some amazing documentaries about this. But the Navy SEAL BUDS instructors identified something that was very interesting. They discovered that it wasn't always the fittest, strongest SEAL candidates that dropped out or burned out on the course. I mean, there were guys there that had come in with all sorts of accolades and physical achievements behind them, and yet they couldn't always predict, just based on those accolades and physical attributes, which were the ones that were going to quit, were going to give up, were going to walk away. And they came up with what they called the 40% rule. And it's based around the idea of resilience. And that is that for many of the SEAL candidates, 40% more performance was achievable by them than they thought was possible. But the difference was not based on physical capability and physical resilience. It was based on their mental resilience and how they thought about the problems they were facing. So in other words, it was in their head. It was how they thought about it. It was how they conceived of it. And very often I meet staff and I've met doctors who will say, do you know what, Jeff, there's nothing I can do to change my situation. And that might be true. But one of the features is there's a lot you can do to change how you think and therefore how you feel about your situation. And if the Navy SEAL instructors are right, there is a 40% capability of learning and developing through that, even when we can't always change our external physical circumstances. In the center of a Navy SEAL training camp, there is this brass bell. And whenever it's rung, that means that a Navy SEAL candidate has chosen to drop out. To end the suffering of those incredible assessment courses, which includes 7-mile swims at sea, at night, wearing rucksacks, and then sitting in the surf for 3 hours in the cold and wet. How they do it, I don't know. I think I'd be ringing that brass bell as soon as I possibly could. But you'll know somebody's dropped out when you hear the sound of the bell ringing. You know, folks, every week there are NHS staff ringing that bell, because instead of getting help or being able to admit that they're struggling, they felt that their only alternative was to walk away. And that is so sad. It's a waste of a life. It's a waste of expertise. It's a waste of training, and all of the potential ability that that person has ahead of them. And so one of the things that we've developed in the NHS spiritual care in Scotland through NES is values-based reflective practice. It's a particular tool that we offer to groups of staff to help them look at their working practice, to reflect, and to help them reconnect with their core values and motivations, to reflect on their work in a supportive setting, to enhance their relationships with colleagues, to develop personal resilience and group resilience and well-being at work. Because, you know, this isn't about just me as an individual getting better at looking after myself. It's also about how can we support each other as a team. And as a result of that, this enhances person-centered practice alongside. VBRP in a nutshell is about giving staff time and space, time in the present to review some of their past and recent practice in order to help shape their future practice. What we're finding is that staff are so busy, very often they just don't get the time just to take a breath, to look and to learn and to then develop their practice. And just the intentional act of doing that in itself helps. But it also is important in helping reconnect all NHS staff to their values. When we ask people what brought you into this line of work in the first place, people very often light up because we're talking about their motivation. But what we're discovering is that for a lot of staff, when we come to their actual practice today, they have become detached from that original motivation. And the longing of their heart is to be reconnected to that core motivation. And so that becomes a disincentive if that detachment carries on for a long time. And so helping staff to reconnect to a potential practice, that is to realize that their future practice can change and develop with some of the lessons they can learn from these reflective spaces, massively important. So VBRP helps them create a dialogue between their core values and their actual practice, and that shapes future practice. And then what we're finding is, you know, very often a manager will invite us to come in and work with a team. First session, the team are there, slouch shoulders. What are we doing this for? It's another waste of time. But, you know, within minutes of having this sort of intentional space, staff light up. Because very often they just say, we've never had time and space to discuss stuff like this before. We've never had time and space just to get a breath, to be able to reflect like this before, and to have a chance at shaping things for the future, and staff going away feeling a far greater sense of feeling in control of how they work in the future, and a sense of being valued, and getting a reconnection to that sort of core motivation. So I've rattled on high speed there, probably just about as fast as Lewis Hamilton around Silverstone on a practice lap. I'll leave this slide up on the screen for the time being, because it gives you the contact details of if you want to contact us about the staff wellbeing service. I also have the next slide, in fact, which I'll leave this one up because it's got my email address if you want to, if you'd like to get in touch or have a chat. But I've done all the talking there, and I realise people might have questions or might have comments that you'd like to make there. So Kevin, I'm just going to pass that back over to you with a deep apology for how fast I went through that.
No, that's not fine at all. I don't think that was a really good piece, Jeff. Thank you for that. I don't think Tom is probably back yet. He may jump in if he appears. But I'll kind of handle it well until he appears. But then I'm sure he would have some very pithy commentary as a respiratory physician about use of oxygen masks and looking after yourself. But I'm afraid I can't follow that up because my respiratory physiology days are not as good as his. Thank you for that. As a GP particularly, I think, if I'm right, I'm certainly very much well used to your service equivalent that you provide for us in terms of the listening service that we certainly utilize a lot of within general practice.
Yeah, that's right.
I was just wondering, I know you talk about the values-based reflective practice being the workshop model that staff may utilize. In terms of a framework that you use with the staff on that one-to-one basis, is it very much a case of that equivalent kind of a la counselling reflective process and allowing people to come to their own conclusions, or are there any other structures that are kind of underpinned behind it that you can or might or are allowed to utilize, if that makes sense?
So that's a good question. Obviously, we bring a range of counselling and pastoral experience, through our backgrounds. We all of our work is done in a person-centred way. So what we don't see our job there is to tell people what to do or to take control away from the staff that we're seeing. So we're always wanting to help enhance their autonomy so they can make choices. Normally, to start off with, that means listening to their story and valuing their experience, and obviously reflecting back on that and helping them to sort of identify for themselves what's been going on and sifting through that. But I think it's also true to say that, we use the experience of working with other staff to bring some of the things that we would talk about, for example, in the self-care and well-being workshops, are things then that we can use as tools. And in fact, some of the tools from the values-based reflective practice groups will also then use those tools to sort of facilitate in the one-to-one sessions a sort of exploration with that staff member around maybe what's going on for them, what they can do to help support themselves, and where they can, and I guess an assets-based approach, identifying their own personal resources, but also the resources that are around them that they've never thought of accessing. And one of the reasons people don't access those resources is because they feel that to even do that means admitting, in their eyes, they've got a problem or it's a weakness that they're showing. So helping people understand that that's not a weakness, and that's a completely okay thing to do. It is part of that process. So when they feel valued by us and not judged by us, that helps them, I think, particularly to then see their experience in a kinder way and walk away, I guess, not being hard on themselves, and that allows them. So yes, it's across of counselling facilitation, really using some particular tools.
Thank you. It's interesting your commentary about weakness, and I certainly noticed and recognised that in terms of numbers, there does not seem to be a great doctor uptake at this point in time. You know, with my undergraduate hat on, working to encourage our students to think about, you know, their own self-care and trying to role model. It's really interesting in that's not seemed to be a pickup from some areas of the medical profession in its own right. Yeah. Katie Blaine has asked a question that I was thinking about as well, actually. So can I ask very similar? I just would wondered if there were particular themes. I know some of the themes you talked about may be related to people's own personal circumstances or personal health in a different way. Yeah. And again, some of the things maybe are addressed via the workshops, but are there themes related to NHS as an organisation that can be, or we should be feeding back to the NHS that, you know, the NHS more globally should be dealing with, you know, that kind of,
I think
processes are the things that you're noticing?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think that's where I think one of my personal passions is that what my hope is that what the lessons we learn from this service can maybe help shape the culture within NHS Tayside for the future. So two issues I would want to highlight in particular that I've seen. This doesn't mean these are the only issues, that these are the two that come to mind. Number one is the issue of bullying, you know, within staff groups. That can be by an individual against an individual staff member, or it can be bullying in a group context where a group have isolated another member of staff. So I think what that's about is unhealthy patterns of relating that have become devaluing and intimidatory. That's certainly one, and we know that goes counter to NHS Tayside's own stated policies, you know, about respect to work and all of these sorts of things. But the reality is that that's definitely a theme in a decent percentage of what we experience. The other one is not an intentional problem, but I think it's an inadvertent one, and that is what I recognize is that when practitioners get promoted into managerial positions, having had a professional background in whatever particular type of therapeutic or professional environment they've come from, they've not had the training as a manager or people skills training to know then how to cope with the change in role that comes with that transition. And so at that point, that there can be problems then in terms of how they then start relating to people. And what I would say is very often the problems and in terms of how they impact the people that they manage, those problems don't have to happen if we could do more work at supporting people when they become managers for the first time, in helping them to develop the appropriate skills of knowing how to transition from being a member of the team to now being a manager of the team, and the way the relationship changes. And I think caught up with that is also the sense of a manager's obligations to the organization as well as to the team, and the way people feel pulled in different directions, and then maybe feel they maybe struggle and fail really with that. So that the impacts there can be very negative and are more around people not having the competencies which they could develop if we offered the right training and development and support.
And so is that something that NHS Tayside is aware of then?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we've started doing over this last 12 months is we've started a new audit system where we're doing evaluations based on each session that we provide. They're all anonymized, and then feedback. So we're gathering a lot of data from staff that helps identify the nature of these types of issues. So what we're hoping is a bit later in the year, once we've got a good 6 months data under our belt, is then to be able to start to report that in and identify some of those patterns in a more evidentiary way. But certainly with the aim that we would then look at strategically developing things to help proactively deal with those.
sounds like even an ideal opportunity to come back and present to us again at a grand rounds in the future with some of that data, amongst others.
Yeah.
I have some great questions that are coming in. I'm just kind of trying to make some recover those for you. So from Nick Richardson, who is one of our allied health professionals and leads that. Again, thanking you for the presentation. They're wondering what asks do you have of us as an audience in terms of kind of sharing potential links for the staff wellbeing service, or and or supporting the wellbeing in our teams. See the question.
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, I think as always, make notes of our contact details and information. Care First's details are on StaffNet as well. There is also available now brief psychological interventions for staff. That's come about through the whole COVID situation. So that is there. I think number one, be aware of these things for yourselves, but be aware of these for colleagues, and speak encouragingly to colleagues to point them in our direction. There has been development over the last 12 months through Andy Shewan and Stephen Valentine on wellbeing champions, and the staff wellbeing champions has been now taken up through the wellbeing committee to try and proliferate and see more training to develop staff wellbeing champions, so that we can try and have members of staff in each working area who are specifically have been through the training program and are well gemmed up on signposting and encouraging and how to encourage members within the teams in the right directions. And that I would say is another thing that I'd like to encourage you as we're moving towards the next round of training on that.
I can certainly provide very positive feedback. I'm not certain what is all involved with that training, but I know some of our medical students have undergone the values-based reflective training and trainers training within that, and they're very complimentary about how that works amongst other things. So it really sounds like there's something there to you can utilize within that.
Yeah.
Question from Robert Ray. About how closely you work with occupational health services. Are the services complementary to those offered by occupational health? I guess we're noting that you don't report, it doesn't sound like you're reporting back directly to line managers, albeit you've talked about this maybe future anonymous survey data stuff within that, but I don't know if you can offer commentary to those.
Yeah, so we've had a general pattern in the past of occupational health pointing staff towards us. And so that's obviously that's been absolutely fantastic. Equally, we've pointed people back to occupational health if they've not been there and accessed that as well. So that works in both directions in a way that I think is really important. I've remembered one part of that question, and I think I've forgotten what the second part of it was.
That's right. So do the services, how closely you work with occupational health, and how complementary are your services to those offered by occupational health?
Yeah, so they're very supportive. They're mutual. They go in both directions. What I should just qualify is we don't routinely report back to managers, but we do have plenty of situations where a staff member will say, would you be willing to do a report for my manager, or to feed back to my manager, or to have facilitated conversations to help my manager understand what I'm going to need when I go back to work. So those reports where the staff member themselves are engaging with that and would like that to happen, that's definitely the case that does. So it's not that we don't do it, it's just we don't do it routinely unless the staff member themselves asks it. The point is they're in the driving seat. So yeah.
I'm not seeing any more specific questions at the moment, but lots of compliments again coming in through in terms of how useful this session has been. I'm also mindful of your time and staff's time, and I guess finishing up the now all gives people a few minutes for kind of quiet reflection before they head off to another busy clinic this afternoon or whatever else is that they're getting up to. So really on behalf of Grand Rounds, on behalf of Tom as well, it was just to say thank you very much for coming along and presenting today. Obviously, the contact information you've left for us on the screen, and for all of us that know, the Grand Rounds is recorded and it will be available at a later date online via YouTube. And I would hope perhaps that in the future we'll hear you back again. It sounds like there's some work going on in the background, so it'd be really interesting to hear what data you come up with and maybe give us for the future information and insights with sort of the direction that we're heading in. But very much appreciate you for your time today, Jeff, and also to the service that that you all provide for kind of keeping staff feeling well.
No, that's fine. And anytime anybody wants to chat or just inquire about anything, please do feel free to get in touch with us. And I really do appreciate your time and the opportunity. All the best.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all. Same time, same place next week. Tom will be back as usual, and he'll talk about what's going on.